Welcome aboard Imagination Skyway, your guided tour through the worlds of Disney and Imagineering. I'm Matthew Krull, your host on this panoramic journey, and I'm on a mission to better understand the stories and places we love and the people who bring them to life. Today's episode is our first ever double Imagineer interview. Last fall, I interviewed Imagineer Aarin Richard about his career at Disney, and one of the topics we discussed was his work on the Space Mountain soundtracks at Disneyland and Disneyland Paris. In this episode, Aarin returns with Imagineer Eddie Sotto for an incredible conversation about their collaborative work on these Space Mountain attractions. As you fasten your seatbelt, I encourage you to take out your mobile devices and search for Imagination Skyway on your favorite social media app. Better yet, if you're looking for ad-free episodes, bonus content, or the ability to comment directly on the podcast, head to patreon.com/Imagination Skyway, where you can sign up for a free account or a premium subscription. And if this episode leaves you yearning for a trip to Disney or any other destination, reach out to our partners and sponsors at KMV Travel by visiting kmvtravel.com/skyway. As we begin our journey, please remain seated, keep your hands and arms inside the podcast at all times, and enjoy your journey aboard Imagination Skyway. Last year, I had the chance to chat with former Imagineer Aarin Richard about his career at Disney and beyond, and one of the topics we broached was his work on Space Mountain at Disneyland and at Disneyland Paris. Today, we're going to dive deeper into that subject, this time, not with one, but I think for the first time on this show, two Imagineers. The first, of course, is Aarin himself, so first, welcome back to the show, Aarin.
Hey, good to be here, Matt.
Yeah, glad to have you back. My second guest is another incredible Imagineer whose work goes far beyond Space Mountain, of course, and many of you may have heard, but that is none other than Eddie Sotto. Eddie, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here and love talking about this topic. And great to see Aarin. I have not seen Aarin. How long has it been since I physically saw you, Aarin?
Well, it's got to be around 30 years because...
30 years. So this is exciting for us as it is for hopefully somebody. And so there you go.
It's a little Imagineer reunion. I need to do this more often.
It is.
I need to get two Imagineers who haven't seen each other in a while, or two who have never met, to talk about their projects and experiences together. It's going to bring an entire different dimension.
You could really get a Jerry Springer thing out of this if you were you want to work it. I would get two enemies and bring them together. I got along great with Aarin. I love working with Aarin. So happy to see you.
Maybe a spin-off of this show. We'll do something along those lines.
Sure.
Yeah, Eddie, I mentioned...
Well, the interesting thing about, talking about the Eddie and I not seeing each other, we actually talked like a year and a half ago because that's when this whole Space Mountain kind of, coming back into the public sphere, so to speak, started up. Because we were going to do an article in the Orange County Register, and that kind of fell apart. So it's just kind of...
Right,
right.
Well, this will not fall apart, despite the constant rescheduling we had to endure. It's hard to get three busy people to align on the same time. I'm so grateful we found the time today, though. It worked out. Eddie, I mentioned that a lot of people probably know at least your name, if not your work, but I was hoping, before we dive into the Space Mountain topic, if you could tell us a little bit more about your time at Imagineering, some of the projects you might have worked on that listeners may recognize, and of course, what your role was at Imagineering.
Sure. Well, I was at Imagineering for about 13 years. That's like 1986 to about 2000. I was hired into Imagineering to work on Disneyland Paris and mainly the Main Street USA. I thought I was going to get Discoveryland because Tony Baxter, who's a name I'm sure every listener knows, had seen my work in another project that was all Jules Verne. So I thought I was going to get in Discoveryland or something like that, or Captain Nemo, and I was like all excited about that. But anyways, I got this Main Street. So that began like 5 years of work on that. We built the Disneyland Paris, but meanwhile, during that, was also involved in one of several iterations, including the final of Indiana Jones in Anaheim, working with George Lucas on concepts for Tomorrowland back in the late 80s. Some lots of very different things. But say the original pitch and concept and development of Mission Space, they gave me Tokyo Disneyland as a portfolio. So we built Pooh's Honey Hunt and Queen of Hearts Restaurant. So many different projects, and also I'm a voice actor, so you may hear of me as Shrunken Ned, the jungle's only self-service witch doctor. You might know about that, or the train at Walt Disney World, now arriving for a grand circle trip around the Magic Kingdom. Anyway, so all of that fun stuff, that was a lot of it. I ran my own design studio within Imagineering, so they made me like a senior vice president of concept. So this is where it got interesting, is that Marty Sklar, who was the guy running, my boss next door, he said, I said, I want to do more than this Main Street theme park. I want to do a lot of things. So I started working with ABC, developing TV shows, Times Square Studio, where Good Morning America comes from. That was a project our team worked on, lots of different things. And I had Tokyo going. And Tokyo, you could kind of experiment out there. So there's a lot of little fingers in the pie. So these assignments would come along. And Federal Express was going to write a check for Space Mountain for a couple of $1 million, or at least $1 million. We're going to get $1 million of it, and it goes off to marketing and stuff. And so that opportunity presented itself. So I had this sort of freedom that most Imagineers didn't have to suggest. I could go into Marty's office and say, hey, let's do this ride about space, or let's go over and build the Encounter restaurant at LAX. And we did. So that was this wonderful time period of pseudo autonomy, and then it all ends. So I would get these oddball things, and I loved that. And we had a great team of people, like 5 different top designers from outside the company helping, to do things. So I loved my career there, and in Disneyland Paris, that the Main Street's considered to be, a very fine project from the team of people that worked on it. And I was happy to lead that and be a part of it. So anyway, that's my Disney background, but there you go.
Well, and we'll maybe have to reconnect to dive into your career as a whole, like we did with Aarin, because you have worked on so much, and I'm glad you included your voiceover work, because I'm sure some listeners probably recognize, myself included, that voiceover brought me back to that era. But thinking about
including voices on Space Mountain, by the way.
That is interesting.
Not to exclude that, including in the FedEx redo in Walt Disney World. Yeah. I did sort of a Walter Winchell. In the future, people will transport their packages through beams of light.
I remember that.
And then so I guess that loop played to the point where small children were, calling it traumatic or something. But anyway, that played there, and we have ignition. There was a couple little self-imposed voiceovers in the track that Aarin produced.
That's amazing.
Right.
So it's all in there.
So how
we have our Space Mountain mug today, by the way.
Oh, geez.
There, little Disneyland.
I want one of those.
Yeah, well, I found it quite some years ago, and I thought for this interview, I would drag it out and put the Jack and Coke, the coffee in there today.
Yeah, that's great.
That is an incredible mug.
All right.
So let's talk a little bit about this synchronized onboard audio track for Space Mountain. And Aarin, how did you get involved in this project?
I think the first I really heard of it was when Eddie came into my office. Probably starting in around 92 or 93, I was the in-house music producer at Imagineering. And so by the time Space Mountain came around in 95, I had already done Tower of Terror and Indiana Jones, and was writing music for the Virtual Reality Project and some other things, Nautilus over in
Great stuff.
And so I guess, by the time Space Mountain was kind of being talked about, the word had filtered through the company that if he had music on a project, come and see Aarin. So sure enough, one day Eddie walks into my office and he says, hey, we got this idea and here's the concept. And he asked if I could, write the score for it, compose the music and arrange it. And so, of course, I was, let's do it. But though, Eddie had the idea for Aquarium, which was part of the Carnival of the Animals suite, which by Camille Saint-Saëns, right? So I knew that piece of music, and I thought, how's that going to work? If you know that piece of music, it's like really floating, kind of soft piece of music. And it's the antithesis of what you'd think of as surf guitar music, which was Eddie's concept for that part of the ride. But it really wasn't until later when I picked up a guitar and started playing with that melody and said, Eddie, this is a brilliant idea. This is really going to work. So anyway, I signed on, and, next thing I knew, Eddie and I were driving down to the park, down to Anaheim after hours to ride the ride a bunch of times and start getting timings and identify spots in the ride where we wanted things to happen. And, with that little data, I went back to my studio and started just noodling around and coming up with really experiments to begin with. They were just rough ideas. And Eddie would stop over and we'd, talk about this, throw this out, keep that, and just keep bouncing ideas back and forth. And that's how I got going with it.
How did you come up with this concept, Eddie?
Well, admittedly, I just heard. So here we get this FedEx deal, and some money comes in, and I thought, because my first day at Imagineering, crazy enough, they didn't know what to do with me. They sent me down to Disneyland, and I thought it would be cool if you had video monitors in the queue of Space Mountain because it was so boring in there doing something. So I'd always had that idea, and they said, "Well, FedEx is going to come aboard," and I thought, you know what, if we could do some like MTV in space. Satellite feed. Like. Well, yeah. Well, it was called SMTV, Space Mountain Television, and we would have music videos and crazy stuff on there. So I thought, well, maybe we could do that. That would be kind of fun, and put some music in there, and just kind of youth it up a little bit, and make it a little bit funner. And then it comes to me. This is, well, you know what? The R&D folks are actually. Simultaneously, are these guys want to put music or onboard audio onto the coaster? I said, well, what would that cost? That now we're doing something that the guest will really walk away with, and that's kind of all I knew, to be honest with you. I mean, is it that there was an effort to do something like that?
How many times did you have to ride Space Mountain to come away with the notes you needed?
I came away with 30.
Yeah,
with the lights on. Yeah, we went out in the middle of it. Well, I don't know what stage it was in the project. We probably had demo tracks by then. But at one point in the project, I don't know if you remember this. I remember we went out like at 1 a.m. We just wrote it. And I remember counting this thing, and with the lights on, just writing it. But by the way, you have to do that. You have to have it where you have a photographic edit bay in your head to know when the next turn is, and also get the feel of what the guest is. And by the way, when you ride the ride, like Aarin says, just over and over again, you hear the noise. There's a tremendous amount of a certain ambient dB of just the room and the resonance of the track. And it was a rough track. It was almost like a wood roller coaster, just about, a little smoother than that.
Yeah. They smoothed it out in the 2005 refurbishments, and then it became really smooth, fresh new steel track at that point. But yeah, it's still a bit like that in Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. It's an old attraction, so short of any updates to the track, it can be a rough experience. So that's interesting. I was curious how that came about.
Yeah.
So, I don't think I share this with either of you, but I'm curious. If you had heard the story before, I had Tom K. Morris on the show, and he was talking about synchronized onboard audio concepts going back to the 70s. And how, he would be driving his car through Southern California and trying to time out, the music in his car with certain parts of the road. And that's how he came up with this idea. So I'm almost picturing in my head, like Tom has this concept, passes it off to R&D. R&D works on it. Eventually, it makes its way over to you. But did you at any point interact with Tom or chat with Tom about it?
Well, what you don't know is Tom and I have known each other since childhood.
Oh, wow. So you have a history going back way before Imagineering.
Yeah. So I met Tom at the Anaheim Public Library when I was like 13. And I had made a scale model of the entire Disneyland out of cardboard, this little teeny model. And it was on display at the library, and I met him. And then I ran into him again at the stockholders meeting. So Tom and I knew each other. And then later on in our adulthood, through other friends, cast members and stuff like this, because he was a cast member for a while. I knew cast members. I was a Disneyland cast member for a while. I ended up connecting with him, and he wanted to do. He had cassettes that he had made of his own tracks to it. Now it's ironic. I went on Space Mountain, and by the way, they say great minds think alike. Is that in 1977 when Space Mountain opened, I made a cassette using Foreigner's Skyrider or something like that, Star Rider by Foreigner. And I tried to time that out with a cassette player inside the ride. And by the way, the wheels and there was brake smell everywhere. This ride was like twice as fast as it was supposed to be. This is all soft opening. They were testing it. And I was just a guy with an annual pass, maybe 19 years old. And I would just come in and ride it. I would just stay all afternoon as a guinea pig. I would start to time these things out. And so the creative process I had is almost exactly like Tom's. I knew Tom, and then Tom and I actually would exchange mixtapes together. But what I really wanted for Space Mountain, and conceptually, and Aaron might remember this, before Dick, I thought, I feel like let's take the curves, because all the ride is nothing but a bunch of turns and then a reverse turn at the end. I want that slide, that Jimmy Page slide from Whole Lotta Love. Whole Lotta Love. That's what I want, to accelerate that. And if somehow you can synchronize that, so when the guest goes into the turn, they get this roller coaster feel, that would be ideal to me. But of course, there's no Jimmy Page. And then listening to Tribal Thunder, Dick Dale, I learned later, strings his guitar backwards. He plays it upside down, a Stratocaster, and backwards. So when he does a downstroke, it's like a chainsaw. So I ended up going to see him live, and my chest, man, you felt this like no show I'd been to. It was just something about him and that. I thought, this is the biggest problem for this ride, is like whatever music on there, it's got to cut through that room. It's got a lot to cut through. Screaming people next to you. I mean, you think about what it has to do. Well, I thought, only the Dick Dale guitar as a lead, could maybe cut through something like that. I wouldn't be making a mistake. Once this idea was out there, Tony Baxter gets involved. He kind of goes, Michael, Eisner, Michael, this should be like John Williams. This should be like la na 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 na. And I go, look at the line. I don't think everybody in line is into that. That it's just too boring. We got to do something more interesting than that. So then Michael so I fought it. I'm very unpopular. Fought, and so they said, "Well, what would you do?" What, Aaron? Go ahead.
I mean, interestingly, that's kind of the music that ended up on Space Mountain in Paris, was more of a John Williams traditional movie score.
Yeah, and that was, and by the way, it's very, very good. I'm not saying that music is wrong, because it's actually, it's perfectly appropriate. But if you go back to my own,
worked great for Paris.
It did work great for Paris, but I'm bringing all of this baggage into this Space Mountain thing. And so Michael goes, look, you could do whatever you want as long as it's recognizable. I don't want to hear some melody I've never heard before that's stupid. You got to know what it is. Like 2001, you watch that movie, you hear, what you hear is all stuff you've heard before. I want that. But it doesn't have to be orchestral. Hence, Aaron's comment about Carnival of the Animals. I thought, well, what could you abuse and turn into a starry, dreamy thing? Plus, it's in a Disney movie. See, I didn't want to get it rejected a second time. It's in Beauty and the Beast. Yeah. So I thought, okay, take that melody. Aaron's got talent. Give it to Aaron. He'll figure it out. I'll just focus on the Dick Dale thing. Aarin can turn it into this, a little bit psychedelic, spacey, twinkly thing, because there are parts in the ride where you're falling. No. There are ascents and descents to the ride. So the music kind of could work. So I went back and said, well, it's Camille Saint-Saëns. What? Yeah. And it's going to be played on a surf guitar. If you want to talk about Tony Baxter, all these guys go, what what are you thinking? What are you thinking? I says, trust me, it's going to work. It's going to be really, really great. And Aarin will figure it out, right? We'll just give it to Aarin.
Give it to Aarin.
Right. And they're like, well, you'll never get Dick Dale. I go, well, remember, here's what I'm trying to do here. I want something, because Pulp Fiction had just come out. Let's all go back in time.
Right, yeah, sure.
Miser Lou is the title track, and Dick's little 15 minutes of fame just came back to light again, and now Dick's touring again. And I'm thinking, wow, every young kid, when he hears that style, thinks it's Quentin Tarantino and cool. Dad thinks of the Deltones and, Pipeline and all that kind of stuff. The Dick, Let's Go Trippin'. There was the Dick songs of the 50s. It works perfect. Two audiences like it for their own reasons. He won't be that controversial. So I get this Tribal Thunder and start playing in the car. And there's one track called Ghost Riders in the Sky. And I start imagining the NASA space program, all the imagery of NASA, of building rockets and this thing shooting off. And these astronauts are the Ghost Riders in the sky. So I thought, well, that could be in the queue, because it's going to be too shocking to get in the vehicle and just hear surf music. That's way too, So we have to foreshadow this while you're waiting in line. So we would play most of the Ghost Riders, and Doug Miller put together a fantastic edit of the entire history with free footage we didn't have to pay for of the space program. If you can find it, it's beautifully done. It is beautifully done. I thought, okay, all right, maybe we can make this thing work. So let's get to Dick. So I called Dick, and he's like at his ranch in 29 Palms, and he's Dick Dale, and I thought, well, he seemed like he's kind of has a bit of an ego or something, because his music's back. And I said, well, why should I do this thing? I said, well, remember, you lived in Balboa Peninsula there. You played in Anaheim. I mean, you played at the ballroom right there in Anaheim that started surf music right there. You are part of the DNA, Dick. You are pre-Disney. He goes, oh, I know. I went opening day and I climbed over the fence and blah, blah. I go, yeah, okay, good. And so he talked all about Disneyland and all that and how much he loved it. I thought, well, maybe there's like a free pass swap here. And Aarin knows we don't have any money. Oh, yeah. I know. Well, I have no money.
That's why I became the composer, because I was in house. I didn't have to hire somebody from outside. I was like free.
You know what? And me too, because I had this studio. I can bury the costs in other things. So I kind of went over and said, well, Dick, and I just seen this Billy Idol video. I think it's Eyes Without a Face, where he's on top of the Sunset Tower apartments on the Sunset Strip, and he's circled by these choppers with spotlights. So I was thinking, like, what would really turn this guy on? Well, okay. What if we put you on top of the Matterhorn with like 3 choppers with police searchlights, and you're up there shredding your act on the top of it as the king of Disneyland. Not the king of Space Mountain, of all mountains. Man. And this guy, he was so in. I said, well, I know, Dick, but I don't have a huge budget. I don't care about the money. I want to do that. I want to do it. I said, okay. And he wanted to go to Disneyland anytime he wanted, and he wanted to pass or something. So I said, well, we could probably arrange that in the future, especially right after I quit,
And all he did was the guitar parts. Right?
That's all he did was the guitar parts.
That's what we hired him for, one thing and one thing only, and he did it great. The rights came up with the aquarium piece because the ride was already open and running and everything, and I get a call from our legal department, and they said, hey, guess what? Carnival of the Animals isn't in the public domain. I said, what? It was written like in late 1800s, but
correct.
Sanson didn't want to have it published until somewhere in the early 1900s, 1920, or I forget exactly what the date was. So it was still outside of that 100-year thing. So they said, well, how synchronized is it? Because if it's, synced to the track, we're going to pay a sync license, basically, for syncing up music to a medium. So we talked about it, and I said, well, it's pretty synchronous. But, the ride varies slightly, and we figured out how to time it. So the lawyer said, okay, so it starts right at the top of the mountain when you start down, right? And I said, yeah. And it's also part of the first part of the music, too. So it's all one track. And so the lawyer was saying, so if the vehicle slows just a tiny bit, even though you've timed it to the track that everything, comes out on time more or less, there could be a little slippage here and there, right, by a few milliseconds or 1,000 milliseconds, whatever. And I said, yeah, definitely. So she says, then it's not really in sync like a movie would sync up music to it. So that's what we decided, and we didn't have to do the sync license because it just wasn't 100% spot on by the millisecond in sync.
Incredible.
Now, but Aarin, isn't it true, though, that we had limit switches or triggers in the early days that would trigger the licks over a backing track or some kind of a thing in 2 or 3 spots to help you accommodate a 30-second swing based on heat of the wheels and weight of the guests? Maybe I'm living in sort of fantasy land about that, but explain the reality of that to us.
Yeah, so that kind of just gets into the challenges, of the music. From the music standpoint, there was really a couple of things that had to get solved, challenges, I guess you'd call them. And Eddie's idea when he came in originally was, hey, what are the 2 cool things about 60s music? Right, things that happened in the 60s, sci-fi, horror movie music, and surf guitar music. And that's the pitch that I got from Eddie. Let's put those 2 things together on this ride. It'd be great. And I said, yeah, for sure. Well, but the thing is, we had 2 completely different genres of music. If you look at surf music and sci-fi music, they're like on opposite ends of the spectrum from each other, right? So the challenge was, for me, how do I make this into a unified piece of music so it doesn't sound like 2 different pieces of music butted up to one another? When you start out on the ride, the sci-fi section, I actually introduced the aquarium melody in the very first few licks there. Of course, we made it eerie and haunting, but that at least subconsciously introduced the rider to the aquarium piece that was going to come up when she hit the downhill section. Making that cohesive transition, a sense of continuity coming out of the sci-fi section into the surf section was the difficult thing. And there's that last hill right before you get to the very top. I don't know, it's maybe 8 seconds or something like that. I rewrote that piece of music, that little chunk right there, numerous times. Throwing the old one out, trying a new thing, just trying to get a more fluid segue going into the surf section. And to what Eddie's talking about, the big main problem was creating a synchronized music track for a roller coaster. It wasn't an issue for the sci-fi section because that was mechanical, but the timing of the surf section is where it got really tricky because we found out we had like a 30-second variation in possible speed going downhill. And that was because in the morning, the tracks would be cold and the vehicle would just go slower and there'd be less people. And as the day heated up, the tracks heated up, more people, the thing would get faster and faster. So we had to figure out a way to accommodate this 30-second potential variation. And I think the fastest ride down was something like 90 seconds. So you got a 30% or so variation in speed here. You tell any composer you got to deal with 30 seconds of of slop there. It's like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? But the important thing was certain things had to happen at certain times. So when you came off the last part of the hill and into the onload, the finale had to be playing right then. Couldn't be early, couldn't be late. And like Eddie was saying, we had certain guitar parts from Dick that we wanted to have in the curves and stuff like that. So how do you accommodate that? And I remember we tossed around different ideas. Do you remember, Eddie? I think one was that we were going to make different versions of the overall track and make the surf section, cut it in different lengths. And then operations could kind of figure out where the coaster was, how fast it was going, and then play that version. And then they would swap it out for the next version as it sped up. And that completely just, we got rid of that idea like in a nanosecond because we just knew it wasn't going to be tight enough.
Yeah, I think when you think of Walt Disney saying it's kind of fun to do the impossible, you have to understand what Aaron's talking about scoring to a time. 30 seconds is kind of close to the word impossible. I mean, it's pretty crazy. And so I thought, first of all, I just want to jump in and say the way he did the sci-fi, my creative input was to create as much anxiety in the guest as possible. So I believe you brought in, either you mimicked it or you used it, but you really brought in this sci-fi theremin kind of sound as the thing builds. I mean, it's like your heart rate is going to go up 5 beats just from the bottom of the lift to the top of the lift. And then you kind of built to a crescendo for that little, like you just said, that little mini hill. Yeah. And then the music stops. And that's where I say, we have ignition.
And there's a guitar
the rock and roll starts. Yeah.
And then there's a guitar part right over that.
Yeah, there's a little slide there. And then boom.
And I don't think that was Dick Dale, that.
No, it wasn't. No.
That was
you, I think.
No, that was another really great guitar player that I brought in, Carl Verheyen. He was a longtime studio musician in Los Angeles. Oh. I had used him a bunch of times on different...
The Wrecking Crew. Don't tell me we had the Wrecking Crew.
No, not the Wrecking Crew. But Carl came in before we brought Dick in to play guitar. I had him play the melody on the surf section, and some of those kind of whammy bars, some of that is Carl, and that's all interspersed with Dick Dale stuff. So,
yeah. Do you remember this challenge? I'm just coming into my mind now. One of the hardest things for me that I just kept sending you back on, and you were like, Eddie, come on, was the percussion. I felt like the percussion either had to percolate along, or the drums or something had to be more of a driving beat to come up with just the right rhythm to go with the vehicles. And that was like a huge, it always felt too slow to me until you finally got to this spot with all of these things coming together, I think, where you nailed it at the end. But I remember that as a challenge. Percussion was a challenge of it being boop, boop, bop, bop, boop, boop, bop, bop, boop, boop. It didn't sound like a spacecraft or whatever.
I think we redid the drums. We brought in a drummer. We did kind of what you were just suggesting, the earlier version, and it just wasn't working. And then we redid the drums, brought him back in and redid it. I seem to remember waking up one night in the middle of the night and thinking, like, we still hadn't solved the issue, of timing. And I woke up and I was thinking of this idea, and I think, this could actually work. So I went back into the studio the next morning and I started messing around. I augmented some of the tracks that we had, which were still very rough at this point. They weren't finished at all, but I augmented them. I called the engineering guys and I said, hey, I think I have an idea. Can we go down to Disneyland and try this idea out? And even though it was rough, at that point, we could tell it was going to work. I won't give away the Disney magic how we did it, but we finally able to create a music track that could expand or contract according to the speed of the vehicle. And to my knowledge, we were the first in the world to figure out how to put music onto a roller coaster in a synchronous fashion. And synchronous is the key word here, right? In that development stage, both creative and the engineering aspects, that happened first at Space Mountain in California. That was what was happening during late winter of 95.
Wow. How did the timing work out between that and the soundtrack for Disneyland Paris for that version of Space Mountain? Because they were a very similar timeline, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So the way that all came together was Eddie and I first started going down, when we started going to Disneyland to ride the ride and everything, we would leave Imagineering and head down to Anaheim in the company SUV. And when we left, probably left like, 6:15 or something. And I remember it was cold and it was dark and it was winter time, So that's when I was starting, and Eddie and I were starting to work on the music for Space Mountain. It was early '95. And so with Paris, they had a opening date of June 1st. And so we brought in the composer, Steve Bramson, and it was like any other, like a film or any other new ride. You always bring the composer in really as close to the end as possible because timings change. People editing films will take out a scene or whatever, so you want the final edit for the composer to compose to. And it's kind of the same with a new ride, right? Because they're tweaking it all the way up to close to the end. And so with Paris, we probably brought the composer in maybe 6, 7, 8 weeks at the earliest, the longest, I should say, between that and the recording date. So there was no way that we could have worked on the Paris ride and figured this timing thing out for a couple of reasons, right? For one thing, Steve wasn't a theme park guy, the composer for Paris. And, with all the experimentation that we did with Anaheim, that just couldn't have happened with Paris. We just didn't have the time, and plus we didn't have the access to the vehicle. Steve Bramson and myself and Tim Delaney went over to Paris to ride the ride, same thing, get timings and whatnot, and that was probably in April. But we didn't have the ability to drive over to the ride and ride it like Eddie and I would do with California, and experiment around and try this and that. So it just wasn't really feasible for Paris to have figured it out. And I remember, when we got the composer for Paris online, I said, here's how you're going to do it. We already figured it out. Here's how it goes. So Paris opened in June 1st of '95. And I have still a WDI, EYE newsletter from September of '95, and it's interviewing Eddie and I and talking about the now completed version of the California ride. And in that article, it slates that we were going to open in November of '95. And I'm not sure, do you remember, Eddie, was that a soft opening or was it the official opening? Because if you look on the internet, sometimes you see '96 as the year for Space Mountain in California.
I remember being upset that they didn't open it earlier, I believe. I thought they held it or something like this for the opening of the new Tomorrowland, because it was the Tomorrowland that was there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. See, so we're like a movie that gets shelved, by the distributor. I feel like we might have gotten shelved by the distributor, or they were running it and not talking about it. I can't quite remember, but I really wanted them to market it. And I thought that this would have been really a great marketing thing, but they didn't. I mean, I by the way, I had this issue with Dick Dale on the Matterhorn for the opening, and I called entertainment and said, I got a great gift for you. Dick Dale's for your opening is willing to play on top of the Matterhorn. And they go, well, we're not willing to put him on the Matterhorn. Are you crazy? We're not going to do that. What did you promise him? And I go, well, look, I'm kind of in a spot. They go, well, that's your spot, buddy, not my spot. I'm like, okay. So, they put him on top of the real Space Mountain, and I kind of resold that to Dick and said, well, don't you want to be associated with the ride that you did and be on the roof of that? Okay, and I guess on his website, he writes a story about being on this little platform, and you can research this and find this because there is footage out there of him playing up there, and he said it was the scariest, coolest thing of his whole career. That was the favorite thing of his career, was playing up on top of Space Mountain. I was there that night and watched him. But as far as like this soft opening of it, I do remember static electricity issues with creating feedback and crackle and so forth in the speaker system. And there was a certain amount of test and adjust where brushes had to be added and things like that to disperse the tremendous amount of static electricity generated by the vehicles that would interrupt the soundtrack. There were certain installation issues and things that needed to be worked out. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I do. I mean, there was a ton of hardware issues, and
like vibration the whole thing would just come apart with vibration.
I remember, every time Eddie and I, it seemed like every time we went down there would be a vehicle off to the side with a group of our engineers, looking at it, scratching their head, trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to stabilize this playback mechanism here? And there was that. And plus, there was still the issue of R&D had built this speaker bridge, and all those had to be fused onto the vehicles and wired and everything else. So we just had a lot of delays, but I mean, it really worked for us because we just had, as far as the music went, we had a ton of lead time. And we used that to our advantage to experiment, kind of circling back to, Tony Baxter and stuff. I remember in this WDI newsletter thing, it says we even tried a heavy metal version. I don't quite remember that, but I'm sure we did. We had that luxury of time, and Paris didn't really have that luxury of time. But I think what happened was we set aside California to accommodate the recording sessions and stuff for Paris, because their date wasn't going to slip. They had that hard opening on June 1st. So we just kind of put ours on the shelf and got Paris out the door and then resumed. But the interesting thing, and so this is kind of funny in a way, not too long ago, I opened this old trunk I have and I found these old floppy disks that I used to do backups of my files back in the day.
Really? What?
Yeah. I tried to get them to play on, current computer, and I couldn't get them to open. So I still have, it's sitting in back of me here, it's old Mac SE, which is probably what they were written on. And I put them in, and sure enough, I could get them to read. And on one was Space Mountain music. And it wasn't the early revs, which I wish we had, because that would have shown like when we actually started. There were the late revs. They were something like 12 through 17, I think. And they were dated July of 95. So we're in the 30th anniversary. It was something like the 7th through the 20th. And I could tell by my nomenclature how I would name files back then that because they were so close together and they were very late revs, that was the time when we were either just about to go into the Studio A over at Imagineering to start bringing in the live musicians, or we were already in there. It was right in that time period. And back to Paris, there was no way that we could have worked on all that music and all that experimentation from the ending of the Paris recording sessions in June into the mid-July. There was just no way. And what we did is we took all those files and the synthesizers that were associated with the MIDI files, and we transferred all that stuff into a 32-track digital tape recorder. And the reason we did that was so that we could start bringing in the live musicians, Carl Verheyen, Dick Dale, and the drummer. And Dick actually brought a bass player in. We tried to get we tried to get him to play to the track, but he was having a little bit of trouble with it, and I think everybody agreed that day that we would just, scrap that, and we used the synthesized bass that I originally wrote for it.
Well, Dick can't read music.
No.
He plays notes.
Yeah.
Incredible.
I mean, it's funny. I hear this after the fact. They go, well, let's have him do this. Have him go study Carnival the Animal. He doesn't do that. He doesn't study anything. He just sits down and does something and leaves. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, that was it. I mean, the only thing...
really? It wasn't that the truth?
Oh, that was totally the truth. And that's why I had Carl Verheyen play the melody and the other parts, because when Dick Dale came in, like I said, the only thing we really hired him for and what he did was those really aggressive guitar licks, of, that kind of thing. And as Eddie said, he was the guy who could play them really aggressively. It probably didn't sound all that aggressive by 95, but back in the late 50s and 60s, that was, unheard of, I'm sure. He was such a funny guy. Let me know if you remember this, Eddie. I can't remember if you were in the room at this point or not, but Dick's kind of holding court, telling stories. As Eddie said, he had this property east of Los Angeles, and he said, he says, one day I started getting chest pains, like I think I'm having a heart attack. So instead of calling 911, he goes out to his barn and starts pumping iron, like lifting weights to ward off the heart attack. That was Dick Dale.
No, the man was wild. He's a crazy guy. So Laramie Dean, who was his protege, is somebody I later became friends with. And Laramie would tell me all these crazy stories of being with Dick on the ranch, because Laramie toured with him, headlined with him, and played on the ranch. So later I hired Laramie, because he plays like Dick, to do a redo of our song, but try to do the heavy metal version or the surf punk version without all the strings that Aarin had attached. I always wondered, what would this thing sound like if you didn't have all the restrictions? I think Aarin did the perfect emotional curve to this, because, and maybe you don't know this, but I had access to all the guest surveys after this thing opened. Marty Sklar, these guys put you in the spotlight. They're like, okay, you did this. What do the people think? So I would go down to Disneyland, or I would look at the surveys as they came in. And first of all, the music got over 95% love it from guests. I mean, just over the moon, love it. Okay. So here's what I still use in talks about experience design. The way this was crafted, from creating anxiety at the beginning of this theremin, and it goes whoa, all the way to the top, and then this release, and then the whole ride, and then it culminates with the crescendo. People thought the ride had been speeded up. People swore the vehicles, they said, what did you like best about it? That you speeded up the ride, that you made the cars go faster. The power of his music and how he composed this actually created a psychological perception that the ride was faster than it was.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that interesting? To me, that's the most exactly. No, but it's not, yes, the power of music, but it's the power of synchronization, without the discipline of it really being that, but being able to emotionally tap the guest and lead the guest. See, he emotionally led the guest by going up the hill. You're introducing the melody, and it's getting like, why did I get on this thing? I don't want to go on this thing. I don't want to get on this thing. You make a little left-hand turn, then you go up a little higher. Oh my God, I can't turn back now. Then his voice goes, we have ignition. And now you're off, and people are like, oh my gosh,
Yeah,
that's all psychological.
Sure,
so this is what makes music. It's what makes music and Alfred Hitchcock films and everything that he's worked on so fun. It's what seduces me into these kind of things, because as a designer, that's a key tool, right? Are you gonna leave the music and just build some ride with a bunch of show sets? No, the music is, It's a Small World is Peace Through Understanding. And without that song, and it deliberately is there to drill into you a message, without that, or a lot of these Disney rides are musicals. Pirates is a musical, Mansion is a musical, Splash Mountain or Tiana's. I don't know if the Tiana's is a musical as much, but a lot of these are musicals. And you score the momentum of the vehicles in sync with the music, whether you do it technically, as Aaron's talking about the challenge, or you're doing it psychologically as a designer, saying, how do I use this to move someone? And it made me do donuts in the parking lot. So, apparently it must do something.
Yeah. I mean, when we did Indiana Jones.
Oh, yeah.
We had music on the vehicle, but it wasn't particularly synchronized to continual track. And sometimes those cars would stop, the Jeeps would kind of stop, and they had things going on with waiting for the cue to keep going through. And so it was not really synchronized as Space Mountain was.
Well, I don't know that it needed to, because there's so much action, but the one thing you nailed it is when Indiana Jones, the vehicle comes to the top of the hill out of the choice room, like, one of the choices, he's holding the doors, and then you turn, you got the reveal. There's a reveal of the big temple. And that's when you hear this big, that's when you need the music, where people go, oh, oh, oh. Right. And people go, oh my God, what did I get myself into? It's the same as We Have Ignition.
Yeah.
Think of it. Indiana Jones going up the hill with all the little, oh, yes, it's real. I like it. You have looked. But now you're in trouble. Now you have the trepidation, and then the reveal, and then you're off to an adventure.
Well,
that ride as well.
Speaking of the drum parts on Space Mountain in California, it was the same with the guitars. The not the Dick Dale guitar licks, but the melody. and I think when we first started working on that, we played the melody. Carl Verheyen was doing it. He said da 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 da, and it just wasn't. I had him go, okay, double it up,
There you go.
Double picking kind of up and down thing, and that added to that whole aggressive speed idea to the melody. So I'm,
funny.
good thing I had Carl do that, because I don't think Dick could have played that part.
Well, Dick just does what he does. He does his leads. It's funny. So when we redid this song as our own little homage, which is not copying what Aarin did, it's just sort of its own departure. I got Clem Burke of Blondie to come in, the late, unfortunately, Clem Burke of Blondie, to come in and do drums on the track. And now it has to be more aggressive than the ride and make you feel like there's a ride. So if you're familiar with the song Dreamin', which is a series of drum, I guess it cascades or falls or whatever you want to call it, he would just continually, I said, I need the drums from Dreamin'. This is to feel like a roller coaster. And he did that. And it's a very different approach, but the drums are very, very important. And I think you nailed it with the speed of the ride. I mean, what we were doing. So those are all like little critical, everything matters. Everything matters to getting the track. And of course, the technical side was very disappointing to me when I would get on and my left speaker would go out or there would be no sound. And like, there was a little bit of a Debbie Downer in some of the tech side of it.
Yeah, they definitely had problems for sure. And, for the most part, I think it worked okay, but there were some technical things that happened. It wasn't any fault of the concept of the music or anything like that. It was just kind of hardware trying to deal with an old track and vibration and screaming people and everything else, right?
Yeah. Now, did you use a real theremin or did you just use a synth for it?
Yeah, it was just a synth thing.
Oh, well, it worked really well.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
See, that is bringing the sci-fi into it in the right way, right?
So, sure, yeah. I guess the thing I had going for me was it was all based on all that music from those early sci-fi horror movies and Creature from the Black Lagoon or whatever. I listened to all that stuff when I...
Oh, you could tell. You could totally tell, Well, basically, I don't tell them a lot. I tell them as little as possible. Yes, it will be recognizable. It will be Camille of the Animal. Okay. The less meetings you have and the less people bother you, the better your thing is going to come out. I just need to give it. Part of my job as a creative executive is to give Aarin space to do his thing and not have people in his face all the time. I'm sort of like, I'm an artist, but I'm also protecting other artists so they can do what they do best and not be, I'm bad enough to work with. He has enough problems with me just coming in and giving him notes. He doesn't need Michael Eisner. But Eisner, by the way, at the time, was extremely engaged. This guy wanted to know, which, by the way, I appreciate as somebody who works for someone, I want them to be engaged because it makes me happy when they're happy. But Michael Eisner was a very well-read creative executive. And very intuitive. He's not just like a business guy who comes in and goes, well, how many T-shirts do you think this will sell? He could care less about it, which I love,
Yeah, no, he was very engaged. I mean, when I was on the virtual reality project for about 3 years, which was coinciding with the time of Space Mountain stuff. But Eisner would come over pretty regularly because we had a demo platform set up there, and so they could experience what we were doing. But yeah, as far as the Space Mountain music that I was working on, nobody ever came over except Eddie, which was good. I never saw Tony Baxter or Martin come over or Eisner. Nobody. I was just kind of in the studio. And as a matter of fact, speaking of our budget issues, I remember we were in the Studio A, doing all the live recording stuff. The sci-fi section was done. We had transferred that. That was all with synthesizers, but we were still working on the surf section. And we were in there a lot longer than we had planned. And
I do remember that.
Yeah, even though it was our own Imagineering studio, we were paying for the studio time. And so I get a call, and they said, "Hey, Aarin, you're out of money." And it's like...
and that call went to me after
I called Eddie. Eddie, go find us some money, quick. They're going to kick us out. And so,
But that's usually, that was like, that's the order of the day at Imagineering is you're out of money. But this thing, you could definitely go plead to the corporate alliance people and say, guys, we're giving you this thing here for, you gave $1 million or you gave all this money to the R&D guys, and we're the content. We are the content. You've got to give us some money for the content. We're doing an amazing job giving what we don't have. He's using a synth on all this stuff. When the bathroom music, they go get an orchestra to play bathroom music for the parks, right? They put together, Club 33 gets a 3-piece ensemble to do background music. And they spend all that money on that. Well, here's a ride. Yeah, and he's got to do it on a keyboard, the whole ride on a keyboard with a guitar player. So, I think we got it. We got the money,
That actually, the synthesizer stuff really worked in our favor for the sci-fi.
I think it did.
Because if you ever listen to those early recordings from the 50s, 60s, into that era, we would have had a difficult time duplicating that sound, that 60s sound with a real orchestra, but I could do it on synthesizers. So it really was to our benefit that we couldn't afford an orchestra. But like Eddie said, I produced a bunch of stuff for just background music tracks that were done with 6, 8, 10-piece ensembles, things like that, and that's what we did.
Yes, that's incredible. And I think that there's a lot that we can still dive into. I love all these stories, and I think there's even a separate topic about Indiana Jones Adventure, which we'll have to perhaps discuss as well. But thinking overall about anyone who's interested in hearing these stories other than this podcast, are there places that you two are talking about this, or other places that people can go to hear more stories about this soundtrack or any other work you've done?
The only thing I did for Space Mountain, I wrote a piece about the Space Mountain, California stuff. And that's the only thing I did. When you're working on these projects, right, usually it's not the only one you're doing. And you finish one, you're off to the next one, and they're happening simultaneously. And you don't think to chronicle these things. The fact that Eddie and I are 100% in agreement that California Space Mountain was the first one to figure out how to do the synchronous music on a moving coaster with variable times. That was important to chronicle. And then because Space Mountain in Paris had the first opening date, everybody just thought, well, it had to be Paris, but it really wasn't. So, but that's the only thing I have. Eddie probably has more stuff out there than I might.
I think this is, to your credit, Matt, is probably the deepest dive because we're both together. We can corroborate things. This is the #1 deepest dive on Space Mountain. Too bad they didn't have us in Florida for the 50th. Thank you, Walt Disney World. But anyway, I think it's the deepest. My website, which is called sottostudios.com, has a podcast page, which has more than you'll get really sick of it. I mean, there's like 1 million podcasts of the background and so forth on that. I just wanted to mention too, and make a quick plug, is that we did do this fun thing with Jimmy Dale, Dick's son, and Laramie Dean, the guitar player. And then from the band Helix, which some of you Disney fans might know who that is, we got the Wookiee, who played on stage in 1982 to do bass. So I just made it sort of a Saturday Night Live, mashup of people. We basically made it a parody of Space Mountain, a sci-fi parody. Here's the picture disc called Escape from Space Mountain with Clem Burke on there. And so we've got, and it's a fun little record. I mean, it's not the masterpiece that I think that Aarin put together, but it is surf punk. And then Laramie went nuts and even did a comic book on Escape from Space Mountain, which and he didn't ask me, which is kind of a weird thing, but I'm represented in here in this crazy comic book as what is it? Edward Insanto or Insanity, Eddie Insanity. So he's got me in there with how the Wookiee from Helix or something, I don't know what it is, took over Space Mountain. Anyway, a lot of good things you could waste your time on. It's on iTunes, Escape from Space Mountain.
I'll make sure everyone knows where to go.
It's just sort of like, where is it now? Where are they now? And what are they doing? And what's going on? But I'm eternally grateful to Mr. Richard for his contributions, because he truly pulled this off. It's one thing to have ideas; it's the other one to execute. And this was not easy. And the reason I did this podcast is I want to make people to know that this is not an easy thing. This shouldn't just be swept under the rug with another. And by the way, onboard audio on rides, it's now the norm, just like trackless rides.
Yes.
So there's, like you say, it wasn't chronicled, but I would continue to pursue Aarin. And by the way, his Medium thing is very detailed. So I encourage the audience to read that.
I'll make sure to link to it as well.
Yeah, and Matt, your show is probably one of the most in-depth podcasts that I'm aware of, that interviewing.
Well, now it is.
Certainly on this topic.
It wasn't before, but now it is. Now it is.
That's the deepest we've gone into a particular subject.
Yeah, by far.
We'll have to do this again with another attraction. Yeah. Well, I appreciate both of you taking the time on the show. Like I said, we'll have to have you back sometime soon. But it's been great chatting about Space Mountain, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Matt.
We have ignition. Thank you.
Welcome back to Imagination Central. Before you exit this episode, remember to follow Imagination Skyway on social media and share the show with anyone who might enjoy listening to our program. For ad-free episodes and bonus content, create a free account or sign up for a premium subscription at patreon.com/Imagination Skyway. When you're ready for your next vacation, remember that listeners of Imagination Skyway can get rewarded for booking a trip to Disney in 2025 through KMV Travel. Simply fill out the form at kmvtravel.com/Skyway and make sure that you select Imagination Skyway under the How Did You Hear About Us question to be eligible for a special gift from the team. Terms and conditions apply. As you disembark, please remember to remain fully seated until the podcast comes to a complete stop. Then gather your belongings and watch your head and step as you exit. Thank you for joining me aboard Imagination Skyway. And remember, if we can dream it, we can do it.